Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's program taking place on January 27th, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the day Russian troops liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1945, some 77 years ago. This event is being sponsored by Second Story Press and Congregation Habanim. Second Story Press was co-founded in 1988 by Margie Wolf, who is with us here tonight, and three other women dedicated to publishing feminist-inspired books for adults and young readers. Second Story Press's books are sold all around the world, having been translated into over 50 languages, adapted for film and stage, and have won many, many awards. International bestseller Hannah Suitcase, which has been published in over 40 countries, which is one example among many. Congregation Habanim, as many of you know, is the first synagogue in Canada founded by Holocaust survivors after the war. And Holocaust commemoration and education, especially for young people, has been a central part of our synagogue's mission since its founding in 1954. This evening, we're privileged to have with us two of Second Story Press's award-winning authors, Kathy Kaser, who I'll introduce shortly, and Jennifer Gold, who Margaret will introduce a little later. So let's begin with Kathy. Kathy Kaser's books have won a number of awards, including the Silver Birch, the Red Maple, the Hackham Attack, and the Vine Award, which she got twice awards for. A former psychologist, Kathy now travels the globe speaking to children and adults about the importance of keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. I should add that I have a personal connection to Kathy as well. Kathy grew up at Habanim, and her Holocaust survivor parents were very active members in Habanim at the beginning, in its early years. And a number of years ago, Kathy also joined me on the March of the Living. Kathy has spoken a number of times at Habanim about her previous Second Story books, The Secret of Gabby's Dresser, as well as the book she worked on with Jordana Leibowitz, To Look a Nazi in the Eye. We're so thrilled to have her back with us again this evening to discuss her latest book, Under the Iron Bridge. One last point of intersection with our synagogue is that Kathy's latest book is set in Dusseldorf, Germany, and many of our founding members were refugees or survivors from Germany, as well as including from Dusseldorf. So let's give a warm virtual welcome to Kathy Kaser as she discusses her latest book, Under the Iron Bridge. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Really a pleasure to be here. And yes, Habanim has a very special place in my heart. Having grown up there, my parents were among the founding members. And similarly, Second Story Press has a very special place in my heart as the publisher of many of my books. So bringing these two entities together for this evening is really so important for me. I'm going to be talking about Under the Iron Bridge, but I just want to bring up my slides here for a moment and show you just some of the books that I've written. I've written more than 25 books that focus on the Second World War and the Holocaust. As I said, I'm only going to be talking about a couple of them today. So if you want any information about any of my books, then please go to my website, kathykaser.com, and you can read about what I do and how I do it and the many books that I've written. So one of the important things to know about me is that I am the child of Holocaust survivors, as you've heard. My mother survived the war in hiding. My father was a survivor of one of the concentration camps. And I grew up listening to their survival stories. I came from a family of talkers, privileged to hear my parents talk about their survival stories. And when I began to write, I knew that there was one story that I wanted to start with, and that was a story about my mother, whose name was Gabby. My mother was forced as a young girl to hide in a dresser that was in her mother's dining room while Nazi soldiers were searching through the house looking for her. Her mother, my grandmother, actually held the key to the dresser in her hand, and she held the key so tightly that after the soldiers had left and Gabby had climbed safely out of that dresser, when my grandmother opened her hand, her palm was actually bleeding from the indentation that key had made. And that story of how my mother hid in that dresser became my very first book, really launched my writing career. My first book, The Secret of Gabby's Dresser, published by Second Story Press. Gabby's story didn't end with her hiding in the dresser. Eventually, my family had to find a safe place to hide as a family. They ended up traveling to a mountain village north of where they were living, and they hid there in the hayloft of a barn that was owned by a Catholic farmer and his wife. And they hid there for a year and a half until the war ended. And that story became the sequel to The Secret of Gabby's Dresser, a book called The Night Spies. So my writing comes from a deeply personal place. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk about my very latest book, Under the Iron Bridge. So I'm going to tell you about this book, but I should say off the bat that this is a very different book for me. Typically, I write stories that focus on the survivors themselves. And these are the faces of just some of the more than 100 survivors that I've met and interviewed for the many books that I've written. Again, privileged to hear these stories. And we all know how important it is. We have this window of opportunity to capture the stories of survivors and pass them on to the next generation. So I love writing books about survivors. But as I said, lately, I've become more and more interested in telling the stories of rescuers, those individuals who saved or helped Jews during the Holocaust. These are individuals who demonstrated moral courage and good citizenship at this dangerous time in history. And in this climate of rising anti-Semitism, it is so important to hold up these brave individuals for numerous reasons. One, I think they act as role models for young people, certainly role models for all of us, but particularly for young people, giving kids an example of what was possible at that time. We know the truth is there were not enough rescuers, and had there been more, the outcome of this time in history could have been dramatically different. But in addition, I think these stories of rescuers provide a sense of hope for young readers, and they build compassion. They're examples of stories that build compassion in young people, allowing them to see others doing these positive acts. So Under the Iron Bridge tells the story of a group of rescuers. But as I said, it's a different story that I've written because these rescuers actually started out, if you will, as perpetrators, those who believed in Nazi ideology before breaking away from that. So this is the story of a group of young people who were known as the Edelweiss Pirates. And here you see a picture of them. I love that name. I think I wanted to write that book just after I heard the name Edelweiss Pirates. This was a loosely organized group of teenage resistance fighters between the ages of 14 and 17, who lived in cities across Nazi Germany, both girls and boys. They called themselves the Edelweiss Pirates because they wore on their collar or lapel a pin in the shape of the Edelweiss flower. The Edelweiss flower comes from Austria. It grows out of the mountain faces and rock faces. It's known to be this very hardy flower that survives in all conditions. And that's how the Edelweiss Pirates saw themselves. They saw themselves as strong, resilient, able to survive no matter what. But more importantly, the Edelweiss Pirates were completely opposed to Adolf Hitler and opposed to Nazi ideology. And in particular, they saw themselves as completely different from the Hitler Youth. So there you see on the left a picture of the Hitler Youth, the mandatory organization for boys at that time. Adolf Hitler was grooming these young boys to be future Nazis, future soldiers in his army. Hitler once famously said, whoever controls the youth has the future. And I think that speaks to the power and influence that he thought he would have indoctrinating these young people into the Nazi movement. But I think it also speaks to the courage and determination of the young people of the Edelweiss Pirates to rise up against that ideology. There was an equivalent organization for girls called the League of Girls. These girls were not being groomed to be soldiers, but they were being groomed to be good Nazi wives who would eventually bear future Nazi children. So these teens, as I said, became one of the largest youth groups that was opposed to Nazi activities. They actually started out somewhat as a social group. They distanced themselves from the Hitler Youth and the League of Girls. They looked very different from the kids who were involved in those organizations. They wore colorful clothing. They wore their hair long. They sang songs that were illegal. But eventually they became more defiant as the war progressed. They began to offer shelter to escaped prisoners from labor camps. They invaded raids on military depots. They stole explosives and supplied them to other resistance groups. Their activities, of course, were considered completely subversive by the Nazi government. Those who were caught were sent to prison. Some were hanged. And in total, we think there were a total of more than 5,000 young, brave teenagers who were part of the Edelweiss Pirates. So as I said, I was fascinated when I first heard this story, and I was determined to create a book for young readers. So Under the Iron Bridge tells the story of a fictional German boy whose name is Paul. Paul has been forced to join the Hitler Youth. He hates everything about this group and about the ideology that they stand for. He doesn't know what to do about that until one day he meets a group of teenagers working to undermine the growing power of the Nazis. And they are, of course, the Edelweiss pirates. Paul makes the courageous decision to join them, and his life is turned upside down as he faces the danger of being part of this group. So I want to read you a very brief excerpt from Under the Iron Bridge, just to give you a flavor of this book. This little excerpt happens when Paul is still a member of the Hitler Youth, and he and his troop members are meant to be supervising a group of Jews who are on their hands and knees scrubbing the pavement in Dusseldorf where they live. He's supervised by his troop leader, a young man named Franz. You'll hear his name in this excerpt, and you'll hear one other name, and that name is Analia. Analia is a Jewish girl who was a great friend of Paul's before the war, and she and her family have disappeared. So this is Paul's reaction to being forced to supervise these Jews. This can't be happening. Paul's brain was on fire. He felt sick to his stomach. He needed to run away, escape, hide, but he had to do as he was told, or there would be even more trouble for him. His eyes darted in wild circles, trying to figure out what to do and where to stand. He finally picked a spot behind some of the other boys where he couldn't see the faces of the people kneeling in front of him. Maybe if he couldn't see their humiliation, he could pretend it wasn't really as bad as it was. That's what he was trying to talk himself into believing. He was trying to keep his head down, not to be seen, when suddenly someone cried out. Paul peered around the shoulder of the boy in front of him and saw that an elderly Jewish man had faltered while trying to get onto his hands and knees. The man was sprawled out on the pavement, struggling. Without thinking, Paul pushed in front of the boy, blocking him. He was just about to reach out and help the man when suddenly Franz appeared. "Get on your knees," Franz shouted at the man. His face smoldered with complete hatred. "I said on your knees." Franz's voice was high and tight. This time the man cringed and covered his head with his arms. "I'll teach you not to ignore me," Franz yelled a third time as he lifted his arm, ready to strike. "Troop leader," Paul shouted out. Franz paused and turned. His face was still dark, his eyes still threatening. I'm sorry, troop leader," Paul stuttered. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. "But some of the boys down the line need your help to get themselves organized. They're crowding each other and don't know what to do." It was the only thing he could think of to say. Franz, arms still in the air, turned slightly to look down the sidewalk. Sure enough, several Hitler Youth boys were standing in a cluster, jostling one another. "You boys," Franz bellowed at the group. "I told you to supervise the Jews." With that, he dropped his arm and marched toward the boys. Paul exhaled the breath he had been holding. He was just about to move back and disappear behind the other boys again, when a girl at the far end of the row of Jews raised her head. Paul sucked in his breath once more as their eyes met. It was Analia. She was there, kneeling on the ground, scrubbing the pavement. Her mother and father were next to her. Her eyes met Paul's and stared. So I really hope you read this book to find out what happens to Paul and the other members of the Hitler Youth. I think this really is a story of courage in the face of inhumanity, and a story that I hope will influence kids to think about how they might stand up to injustice in their communities, how they might examine their own lives and choose to act compassionately, following the example of the Edelweiss pirates. So I will stop there and ask Ellie to rejoin us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you for those very eloquent words and that passage just read to us. Just let's start. Where did the title of the book come from?
Under the Iron Bridge. Titles are such an amazing thing. Margie can attest to that. We go through many titles trying to find the right one. In the book, the boys actually gather under a big bridge, an iron bridge that actually existed and still, I believe, exists in Dusseldorf in the center of the city. And when they would, when the kids would be doing their resistance activities in the city, they would meet under this iron bridge to plan together and to think about what they were going to be doing. So I did not come up with the title, but when it was raised to me, I really thought it was a perfect title for the book. Sorry, Ellie, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I just got myself unmuted. Is that part of the history? Was there actually an iron bridge where the members of the Edelweiss gathered underneath?
There was an iron bridge in Dusseldorf. I'm not exactly sure if the Edelweiss pirates gathered under it, but it made sense to me that this would be a place where they would come together and plan some of their activities.
And historically speaking, were some of the members of the Edelweiss caught by the Nazis, tortured and executed?
Oh, yes. I mean, there are documented stories of pirates, excuse me, of pirates that were imprisoned and those that were hanged for their subversive activities. There's one in particular, a young boy by the name of Bartholomew Schlink, who, the story of his life and his involvement in the pirates and his execution is probably the one that is most documented in the story of the Edelweiss pirates. And I do create in the book the story of one character who is executed for his activities.
And what do you think it was inside of these children's hearts that made them choose differently from the people who joined the Hitler Youth? Was it their upbringing? Was it in a sense of independence? Was it an ethical thing? Was it a religious thing? What do you think went on that one group of children chose A and another group of children chose B?
Yeah, it's the question of why did some choose to help and others stood by? If we could look into the minds and hearts of those who stood by and those who helped, maybe we would get a clearer answer of that. But I think it could be all of those things that you mentioned, Ellie. For many of these young people, they did have parents who were supportive of what they were doing. Not all of them, mind you, but some did have parents who were supportive of what they were doing. Some who just morally felt that the activities of Adolf Hitler were repugnant and they had to stand up against it. Some who were just rebellious and defiant and wanted to stand up against anything that they were being told to do. So I think it could have been a number of those things. I think the fact that they came together as a group, there is that power in numbers and that comfort in numbers. And the fact that there was a group of them that were working together was also, I think, incredibly important.
Kathy, it's interesting because, we ask ourselves what we would have done had we been alive at that time. We've been children. I know certainly I would not have joined the side of the aggressors, but I don't know if I don't have the courage to join the side of the resistance. What do you think? If you'd been a child back then, do you think you would have done that?
I ask myself the same question, Ellie, and I have that mental debate. I would like to believe that I would be one of those who stood up and stood up strong. But it took tremendous courage to do that. Let's not minimize the danger that was present to those who spoke out against the Nazis at that time, to those who were willing to risk their lives, really risk their lives for their Jewish friends and neighbors. If we were put to the test, I'm not sure how any of us would behave in those times. I like to believe we would stand up for our friends and neighbors. And listen, what I do in my writing is hoping to set that example for young people today. Use the story of the Edelweiss pirates as an example of what was possible and what they might be able to do when standing up against injustice in their lives.
Kathy, you just reminded me of one of the most heartbreaking stories I ever came across in the Holocaust. Is two little boys were brothers playing on a field in a soccer field in Lithuania, and right in the middle of the game there was an action. They were taken, put on a train, and sent to the concentration camps. And as the train was departing the train station, they passed by the soccer field where they had just been playing soccer just a few hours before that, and the train was broken. There's a little bit of a latch, a little bit of the wood was broken. They could see through the soccer field, and one of the men said later on in life, terrible things happened during the Holocaust, but the worst thing was when the train left the station. We passed by the soccer field. I looked through that broken slatch and I saw my friends continuing to play soccer like nothing had happened. And that moment of indifference from his best friends broke his heart for the rest of his life. So it's so beautiful to have another side. But that leads me to my last question. This is a question Steven Spielberg was asked, like, the Holocaust, what's such a terrible example of atrocities and inhumanity and cruelty? Why would somebody focus on perhaps what was an anomaly, what's much less of a percentage-wise actions of human beings? Well, why didn't you more focus on the atrocities as opposed to the nobility? I think you alluded to that answer in your presentation, but I think it's worth dwelling on a little more.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have written books that focus on that side of the history. We cannot forget that side of the history. We must talk about the atrocities. But especially because I write for young people, I really believe that there has to be a balance in this writing. Young people have to understand that there were things that were possible, like these brave acts. and that both are important. Both the atrocities are important, but certainly those who stood up against them, holding those individuals up is also important. It's not an either or. So I think both are incredibly important.
I agree with you 100%. Again, thank you for eloquence and bringing this story, which I had not known until now, to light to the world. So beautiful words. So now I'm going to ask my colleague and dear good friend Margie Wolf to take over for the second part of our program. Margie, please.
Hi, hello. Kathy, that was terrific. And I know it is a terrific book. But one of the things that it's interesting that Ellie raised was she asked a couple of historical questions. Was this really true? And for someone like me who is, and I think for many Holocaust educators, we have to ask the question, should we be publishing books that are fiction, all right? And that are fiction, because we all know about the Holocaust deniers. We all know, is this fodder for them? And there is really a real division amongst scholars about what should be done. And I struggle with it with every book. And so when a novel, and many of the, I guess, 25 or 26 books focusing on Holocaust literature, at least half, maybe more, are what we call narrative nonfiction, and some are historical fiction based on people's accounts. All right, Kathy's family's own stories, people she's talked to, and others are create a fictional story with people and places that we know are real. And it's the last one that is the biggest challenge. And so when I'm asked that, and I've been asked that a lot and discussed it with even with Yad Vashem, what I realize, and what Kathy and what Jennifer do so beautifully, is they tell a story. And what I also learned from Yad Vashem is that, because they asked me, so how come your books do better than ours? And I realized, thinking about it, is that yours share information, mine tell stories. And I think Kathy has developed a huge reputation internationally for telling stories, many of them fiction, that feel real. And we, in every book that we try to do, is even in a fictionalized count, make sure that it feels real, because I don't want some kids thinking, oh, that's just a story. It has to. And I think Jennifer, who has done, this will be her fourth novel, but it is her first one that deals with Holocaust literature. I read the manuscript when she submitted it several times, thinking, is there enough here that feels real and feels viable that I'm comfortable publishing this story? Now, Jennifer is a hugely talented woman. She is a lawyer by profession and works still as a lawyer. I believe she has also a degree in public health. She has kids, she has raises them, and she writes fat books, So I don't know actually how she does it, but does them beautifully. And each one tells an extraordinary story. But this is the one I had to be most careful with, because I think there is consequence for not doing it right. Kathy has learned how to do it right. And I believe Jennifer here in Names in a Jar, her newest, this book that she'll be talking about today, does that well. There are things in there that are true, there that we know about. We know about Treblinka. We know about children going into hiding and living as Christians. There is much in here that feels true, so that I can comfortably say that, yes, this belongs within the catalog of viable Holocaust literature. So, and one big difference before introducing them is that Kathy came from a family of survivors. Jennifer did not. So she brings a truly different, I think, perspective when she writes this. So let me introduce you to the highly talented, highly committed, very prolific Jennifer Gold.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Margie, for that very flattering introduction. And thank you for having me here tonight. It's a great honor to be speaking to this audience on this day, and to be sharing a virtual stage with Kathy Kaser, whose books I have read with my children. On that, some of the points that Margie was just discussing, I just want to say that I think telling a story as opposed to just reciting facts is such an important way of conveying important historical information, especially to children. So a few weeks ago, I did a book club with about 200 teenage girls, and this was not a Jewish group. I have spoken to Jewish teenagers before on this topic, but these girls were primarily not Jewish, and a lot of them knew absolutely nothing about the Holocaust. And they said that it wasn't something they had been inclined to learn about. They weren't really interested in it, but they liked the story. And the story pulled them in, and it inspired them to learn more, and it made them want to understand more. So I think there is such a place for storytelling if it's done well. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So the inspiration for this book was, I was speaking to a friend of mine who's Polish, and he mentioned Irina Sendler. And I had never heard that name before. I went to a Jewish day school. I had an extensive Holocaust education, but that was not a name that I'd heard. So I started doing some research, digging around, and I was really taken by this story. Irina Sendler was a young Polish social worker working with the underground, with the resistance, and she managed to smuggle out hundreds of Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto, and she hid them in the countryside and throughout Poland with Christian families. And what she did was she wrote each one's real name and the new name she gave them, the one that they went into hiding with, and she would put each slip of paper in a jar, and she buried the jars in her garden. And I thought that it's almost a poetic tale, and so much bravery from one, quite young woman. And we don't hear a lot about the women who were brave and who's acted in heroic ways during World War II and the Holocaust. So I started thinking, like, this was something that I wanted to build a story around, and how could I do that? I started, doing research because, as Margie said, if it's not accurate and real, it really shouldn't be out there, particularly in the realm of Holocaust fiction, historical fiction generally, but it is so incredibly important that Holocaust fiction be accurate. And when I was digging, I found other stories that I wanted to incorporate. One of my characters ends up in Treblinka in a concentration camp, and I wanted to have her escape. But I wanted it to feel real. And so I wanted to ensure that there had been concentration camps where people had escaped from. And I came across another story that inspired my writing. Another righteous amongst the nations, Jerzy Bielski, who, along with his Jewish girlfriend, Sila Sibilska, escaped from Auschwitz. It's a little love story. They met in the camp. He stole a uniform and he smuggled her out of the camp and hid her with his uncle in the countryside. And my character, Lena, in my novel, she has a similar experience. So that's something else that I used from history to inspire my writing. In writing this book, I didn't want to just, write a so-called another Holocaust book. I wanted to contribute something that was a little bit different, unique, put my own spin on it. I really wanted to have a feminist narrative. Starting with Irina Sendler as my inspiration, my two main characters are a pair of sisters, two girls with very different personalities. The oldest, Lena, is very quiet, she's shy, she's a writer, a dreamer, and she is the caregiver for her younger sister. Their mother passed away in childbirth. Her little sister, Anna, is the opposite. She's brave, she's spunky, she's very extroverted. She wants to be a scientist when she grows up. And what I do is I try and walk through how these two girls are very brave, each in their own way, really act in a heroic manner during the course of the Holocaust. So I try and bring a bit of a feminist narrative to it. I also wanted to add in a little bit of diversity, and I introduced LGBTQ character who is also not just a victim of the Holocaust, but also is extremely brave. She's one of the most heroic characters in the book. It's not something I had seen done before, so I wanted to introduce that element as well. The final thing that inspired me to write this story, which is about two siblings and their love for each other, is that I'd written about siblings before in a previous novel of mine, and I really enjoyed using that relationship as a love story as opposed to the traditional teenage love story. There are romantic relationships in my books and in this one as well, but the primary love story is between Lena and Anna, the two sisters. My inspiration for that is actually the Disney movie Frozen. When I saw that movie with my children, I really liked that was the relationship that they focused on and not romantic relationships. So I wanted to show these two girls and their love for each other and how that drives them and their will to survive and their heroism. So in terms of the story itself, Lena and Anna are two sisters. They're growing up in Warsaw. Their father owns a bookshop, and they both kind of grown up within the bookshop. They don't have very much money. Their mother passed away and shortly after giving birth to Anna. And Lena both works in the bookshop. She takes in sewing to try and support the family, and she is a surrogate mother to Anna. Anna, as I said, is very extroverted. She's very curious. She's a little scientist. She likes to read anatomy textbooks in the bookshop. And so it shows the story of how they're very close and they're growing up. And then the war comes and they are separated. Lena doesn't tell Anna, but she has her placed with a Christian family through the Irina Sendler character. Lena ends up in Treblinka after doing some work with Irina Sendler for forging documents, engaging in the resistance in her own way. And the book tells these two stories and also shows how much each one wants to survive to get back to the other one. Especially the lengths that Lena will go to in order to find her sister again. And there are times when Lena really feels like giving up, but she's motivated to go on to find her sister. And what I tried to do in the book was really emphasize the unique voice and ability and heroic actions of each girl. So the messages in my novel that I would hope a reader would take home are the idea of feminist heroes. And I know there was a recent book published on a lot of women who were involved in the resistance in the Holocaust and World War II. And I think it's great that those stories are being told. The idea of siblings as a love story, as people who were not Jewish, but who helped Jews, as Kathy mentioned, those righteous among the nations, those people who give us hope, especially in a very dark time. like now, where anti-Semitism is on the rise. You hope that someone reading the story who's not Jewish will take inspiration from those characters and understand how, even one person's kind and brave behavior can have a huge impact. And just general themes of resilience and hope and survival.
Jennifer, are you done?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm quite fascinated because you by you bring in pieces of history that people know about. How much research you talked about in the, Treblinka and Escape from Treblinka. You talked about one of the protagonists living with a Catholic family. How much research was it necessary for you to do to make those parts of the book feel authentic?
Lots. So my day job is as a lawyer. So I deal with facts, and facts are important and they have to be accurate. And I bring that to my writing as well, especially in the context of historical fiction. So I did tons and tons of research. I am very worried when I'm writing that something isn't going to be accurate, and that it will jeopardize how the story is received, but also sort of take away that suspension of disbelief that happens when you're reading a book. So not only did I have to look at like maps of Treblinka and do all sorts of research as to what went on there and what it would be like to escape and how would you get out and where would you end up. There were scenes where I had to research things that I never thought I would be researching, like Anna's surrogate mother, the Catholic woman. She gives her first bra, and I knew I wanted to write that scene, but I didn't know what that would look like at that time, right? Like what did a bra look like? What would it look like for a poor family living in the country in Poland? What would they call it? So I had to do quite a bit of research on, because I wanted that to feel very accurate. So we're lucky we live in a time when research is quite easy to do through the internet. And I try and draw on resources I have as well. I had, as I said, I have a friend who's Polish, and I had him translate some things for me so that they were accurate, and look around at some resources in other languages so that I could really capture, what it would be like to come of age as a young girl on a farm in rural Poland.
Mm-hmm. You've said you've spoken to both groups that are primarily Jewish or primarily Christian, or whatever. What do you find a difference in terms of the reactions, the surprise, the
Absolutely.
when you're speaking with them?
Yeah. So I mean, it really shocked me because I've mostly spoken to Jewish students about this sort of work, and there is a familiarity with the Holocaust. It's obviously an important theme in our community and our children's education. And when I speak to students who are not Jewish, they're aware of the Holocaust. But as one of them said, I'd heard of the Holocaust, but like I didn't realize how big a deal it really was. And just those, it was a very innocent statement, but it really stuck out for me because it's been such a big part of my life. And I didn't realize that to other people, it was just another, footnote in history. This is just another bad thing that happened amongst all the terrible things that have happened in history. So, when I spoke with those girls and I saw how this really had an impact on them, I felt really moved in a way that I hadn't before, because they really didn't know anything. And when I went through some of the stories, because some of the details in my book are very difficult. There's, it's a story of the Holocaust, and I really didn't hold back on the atrocities piece, and there's sexual assault and various other terrible things that happen. And they said like they really didn't realize that it was so bad. And I think that if I can just even get a few girls to dig a little deeper, even on Google, about World War II and the Holocaust, and I feel that I've done what I wanted to do in terms of writing this book.
Liberation 75, which I think most of you have heard of, they were the ones who were involved in trying to organize the 75th anniversary events and continue to do so, just released a report which said that 1/3 of Canadian students either thought the events of the Holocaust have been inflated, or they don't even believe it exists. And so it seems to me, and for Kathy has, I think, realized this, but you're newer to this subject area, that it seems to me that there is, I certainly feel it as a publisher, and I'm wondering as a writer, do you feel some level of responsibility in terms, if those figures are correct, and they're actually worse in the United States, that you have a role to play?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that, because that's not what I set out to do. I was just writing a novel like the other novels I've written, but having participated in that book club, and spoken to such a diverse group of teenage girls, it made me realize that there is this kind of a responsibility there, and if I have the ability to tell this story and people are willing to listen to me, I really want to get that out there. So, and it's funny because when I started the evening, I didn't know that that's how it was going to go. And it became more and more important to me that I really engage these girls, and that I impart as much information as I could just in that one evening. And also not just impart the information, but hold their attention, because if they're interested in what I'm saying and they're interested in me, they're going to remember it better, and they're going to go on and learn more. So I think that is absolutely true. Like you start to feel, oh, well, I have the ability to do this, so I have the responsibility to do this.
Okay, thank you. I think that'll be enough for me. Ellie, do you want to open it up for questions now?
Sure. What I'll do now is I'll ask one question to both of you, and then people who are watching, if they want to send a question into the chat, then if Jennifer or Kathy sees it, or if I see, we can do it. But I have a question for both of you. When you're doing your research, do you come across stories that are so heartrending and so cruel and so full of hate that you just say, I can't do this right now, I have to leave it for a while, I've got to go walk the dog? It becomes so overwhelming, you become so despondent. And how do you deal with that personally when you come across these atrocities that are just mind-boggling? So Kathy and Jennifer, please go ahead.
Well, okay, I'll jump in, Jennifer, if that's okay. Look, I spend practically every day reading about this history because I've written so many books about it. So I am going down some pretty dark holes when I'm exploring this background, this history. And when I meet with survivors and I interview them, and they begin to talk about their very dark past. It's a heart-wrenching moment. I always say, I think I have cried with every single survivor that I've ever met. And honestly, if I didn't cry, I don't think I would be doing my job as a writer. I definitely need a break. I have to come up for air. I belong to a book club where I read mysteries and fantasy and all of that other kind of wonderful stuff, because that's my break. That's my yoga, if you will. But when I'm working with this material, then I have to feel it to the depths of my soul. And when I do that, then I think I'm able to do my best writing.
Thank you. And
I
Jennifer?
I would agree with what Kathy's saying. So, I mean, yes, there's that. You definitely have to take breaks and space it out and read other things. But it's when I'm reading and when I'm doing the research or reading something, even if it's really awful, it's like I have a duty to read it and internalize it. Because if I'm going to tell my story, I need to know everything that's come before, and I need to really know it and feel it in order to do a good job myself. If I try and like distance myself or turn it off too much, my own work will not have the authenticity I need it to have.
Very good. I have one other comment, but if anybody in the audience would like to send a comment or ask a question, the chat box is underneath, so please send it and we'd be happy to answer it. One thing I was thinking about, because I've done a lot of reading as well, and when I feel those moments of despondent and despair and wanting to give up on humanity, I say to myself, there's a very famous quote from Emil Fackenheim, not used for this context, but I applied, "Thou shalt not give Hitler a posthumous victory." And I say to myself, if I give up on humanity because of what I'm reading, Hitler will have won. And I may not do that. I must not do that. So that's what runs through my mind when I'm about to despair on all of humanity, that I can't give Hitler that victory and I will still keep on believing.
Well, let's also point out, my reading about this history and feeling the pain of it, that's a fraction of the pain that those who actually had to endure that history were suffering. So I think I can read it and feel that pain, knowing how much worse it was for those who had to endure it.
Yes, I mean, and all of us agree that we don't know how the survivors made it. I mean, I don't think I would have survived for one moment in any of these camps. I mean, I remember I was in March living one year and I was in Majdanek and it was the middle of the winter and I didn't have my hat with me. And I think after about 20 minutes, I thought my head was going to explode. And here were people who lived there every single day being beaten, malnourished, tortured, not properly clothed, sleeping on, and they survived for months, sometimes years, and I couldn't survive for like 20 minutes. So yes, I do agree. What we're reading about is a fraction of what really occurred in places like Planet Auschwitz. So do we have any comments or questions from the audience? Margie, any closing things you'd like to say before I close up?
Sure. I've said this before. I think the importance of these books I can't say enough about how important that they are, particularly as Jennifer alluded to, we are in dark days of anti-Semitism. And I think what these books tell young people is about consequence. What happens when you, not just, you starting from the bullying to starting name calling to whatever. I'm working on a book right now about what hate looks like. And this is what is being seen by teachers and principals in schools now. And there are more swastikas, there's more hate, right, graffiti. There's more and more and more of this than they have ever seen before. And what I like to think is because of writers like Kathy and Jennifer and some of the others that we work with and other people work with, that it will allow kids reading feel some empathy, and that they will do the right thing when they are given a choice. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Ellie, for all the work that you do on Holocaust education. All right. Okay, done.
Okay, so thanks again, everybody. And I'm going to just do a closing comment. Once again, thank you to Kathy and Jennifer for using her God-given talents for such a worthy purpose. Thank you again to Margie and Second Story Press for publishing these such important works. And thanks to our audience for your interest in learning more about the Holocaust. With that in mind, I'd like to close with two very powerful quotes. The first quote is from Henry Appel, who was an Auschwitz survivor. I came across this quote many years ago, and it's never left me. And he said the following: "There's only one thing worse than Auschwitz itself." Now, a survivor of Auschwitz, what could he mean when he says there's only one thing worse than Auschwitz? And he says the only thing that's worse than Auschwitz is if that the world ever forgets there was such a place. The only thing that could be worse than Auschwitz, that the world ever forgets there was such a place. And I want to thank you all for participating tonight, our panelists and our audience, for making sure that the world never forgets the tragic events of the Holocaust. And my closing quote is from Canadian human rights leader and activist, celebrated human rights figure, Erwin Kotler, who reminded us today, I got an email from his office, and the quote was, "Let this day today be not only an act of remembrance, which of course it is, but a remembrance to act." Not just an act of remembrance, but a remembrance to act. So good night, everybody. Lech Shalom. Go in peace.